They said the Wyoming mountains kept secrets, old ones buried beneath stone and silence. When a lonely farmer followed an injured horse into the wild, he didn't know it would lead him to a hidden waterfall, and to a truth that would change everything he believed about life, love, and the things worth keeping quiet. The wind moved slow across the empty pasture, carrying the smell of frost and soil gone cold. Thomas Rayner leaned against the half-broken fence, his gloved hand resting on a post that had outlived its purpose. Beyond the wooden rails stretched a field that no longer yielded, just brittle grass, yellow and sharp under the dim Wyoming sun. It was late autumn, that gray in-between season when everything feels like waiting for an end. Thomas was 58, shoulders stooped from years of plowing, the kind of man whose silence said more than words ever could. The barn behind him sagged under its own memories, the echoes of his wife's laughter, his son's boots, the songs of horses that once filled the valley. Now there was only wind. He lifted his hat as the gust came stronger, a shiver threading through his coat. It wasn't the cold that bit him. It was the loneliness that had become part of the air itself. He'd long stopped talking to anyone but the soil and the old radio that hummed at night. Even prayer had gone quiet after Mabel died. He bent to gather a few fallen planks when something faint cut through the stillness, a sound half buried in the rustle of grass. At first he thought it was the wind twisting through the fence, but then it came again, raw and trembling. A horse. Thomas froze, eyes narrowing toward the shallow ditch that marked the edge of his property. The sound grew clearer, a low, broken whinny followed by the scrape of hooves against wire. He dropped the wood and walked toward it, boots sinking into soft earth. There, tangled in a coil of barbed wire, lay a mare. Her coat, once chestnut, was caked in mud and blood. One leg was caught tight. Every movement drew another tear of flesh. She lifted her head when he approached, one dark eye meeting his, wide, glassy, defiant. Thomas stood still, the breath leaving him in a cloud. It had been years since he'd looked into eyes like that. Eyes that still believed in living, even when the world didn't give a damn. He slid a hand toward the revolver on his belt, the old instinct of mercy that ranchers carried. Out here, ending suffering was part of kindness. But his hand stopped. Something in that gaze, something familiar, stubborn, almost human, rooted him to the ground. He knelt slowly, his knees creaking. "Easy, girl," he murmured, voice cracked and dry. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you." The mare flinched, but didn't strike. Thomas pulled a knife from his pocket and began cutting through the wire, each snap of metal echoing sharp in the air. Blood streaked his gloves as he worked, sweat freezing on his neck. When the last strand broke, Horse tried to rise and collapsed again, sides heaving. He hesitated, then slipped off his coat and laid it over her trembling body. "Stay still," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't understand. The rain that had threatened all afternoon finally came, a thin drizzle turning the dirt to paste. By the time he'd dragged her free and half-lifted, half-guided her to the old barn, night had fallen. The moon hung pale behind torn clouds, casting silver across the sagging roof. Inside, the air smelled of hay, dust, and old wood soaked with years of silence. He spread dry straw across the floor, fetched a bucket of what little water remained in the trough, and placed it near her head. The mare drank weakly, then rested, breath shallow but steady. Thomas sat down on an overturned crate, watching her chest rise and fall. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt a strange unease, as if fate had just walked through his door and lay bleeding on his straw. He studied her again. The torn leg, the sweat-darkened mane, the eyes that still held a flicker of light. "Guess you're stuck with me now," he said quietly. His voice sounded strange in the hollow space, like someone else's voice echoing off the rafters. Lightning flashed through the cracks in the roof, illuminating the mare's form. For a brief moment, she looked like she was made of fire and mud, something born from the land itself. Then darkness closed in again. Thomas leaned back against the wall. The sound of rain deepened, drumming a rhythm that almost felt like a heartbeat. He hadn't shared a roof with another living soul in years. And now here she was, breathing, hurting, alive. He pulled the coat tighter around her flank, fingers brushing the trembling warmth beneath. "You hold on, girl," he murmured. "If you're fightin', I guess I can too." Outside, the storm thickened, washing away the tracks that led to the barn. Inside, man and horse listened to the same rain, the same silence, the same fragile promise of morning. And when dawn came, a gray wash of light seeping through the boards, Thomas was still there, eyes open, watching her breathe. Her chest rose, fell, rose again. He smiled, the smallest motion, like the first crack in ice before spring. "Good girl," he whispered. "You made it." Somewhere in that thin morning light, the story began to move, quietly, like a seed beneath frozen soil. The rain lasted through the night, soft and steady, tapping against the tin roof of the barn like an old lullaby. Thomas sat slouched on a stool near the mare, his hands wrapped around a tin mug that once held coffee, now cold as the air. He hadn't slept. Every so often the horse's breathing caught, a wet rattle that made his chest tighten. Each sound reminded him how close she was to giving up. When the first faint light broke through the cracks in the boards, he rose, stiff from the damp. The mare's eyes were open, watching him. There was something unsettling in that gaze, too aware, too quiet. He crouched beside her and touched her neck. It was burning with fever. "You're one stubborn soul," he murmured. "Ain't you?" He fetched what he could, an old rag, the last of his rubbing alcohol, a handful of hay. He cleaned the wound slowly, wincing when she shuddered. Blood welled again where the wire had cut deep. The smell of iron filled the air, sharp against the scent of hay and rain. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving a pale, colorless morning. Thomas worked without speaking. His breath came hard. His shoulders ached. It had been years since he'd cared for an animal. Years since the last of his horses had been sold off when the drought came. Back then, he'd promised himself he wouldn't keep another. Too much loss in loving something that dies. Yet here he was, pressing his hand to a wound that refused to close. At one point, the mare tried to rise, her front legs pushed, trembling under her weight, then gave out. She collapsed with a dull thud. Thomas caught her head before it struck the floor. "Easy," he whispered. "You don't owe me nothing. Just breathe." He looked around the barn. Everything smelled of age, old hay, grease, and silence. Mabel's paint can still sat in the corner, lids rusted shut, brushes turned to stone. Once, she had painted the valley on the barn wall, a sweep of blue and gold horses running through the field. Now, the paint had cracked into pieces, like a memory breaking apart. Thomas felt a sudden sting behind his eyes and turned away. "Damn fool," he muttered to himself. unsure if he meant the horse or his own heart. By midday, the clouds began to lift. Light streamed through the gaps in the roof, cutting the shadows into strips. The mare stirred, her ears twitching toward the brightness. Thomas noticed how thin she was, ribs sharp beneath her skin, flanks hollow. Hunger would kill her faster than the wound. He rummaged through the feed barrel and found a few handfuls of oats. "It ain't much," he said, setting the tin before her. "But it's honest food." She sniffed, then began to eat, slow and deliberate. The sound of her chewing filled the barn like music. It had been too long since Thomas had heard that kind of sound, something alive, ordinary, and stubborn. When she finished, he filled her bucket again. The water was cold from the rain barrel, and she drank greedily, drops splashing onto his boots. He smiled faintly. "You keep that up," he said, "and I'll start believing miracles still happen." That evening, he opened the barn door to let in air. The world outside had changed. The clouds thinned into long streaks of silver, and the hills shone wet beneath the fading sun. Steam rose from the ground like ghosts leaving the earth. He could see the empty fence line stretching toward the horizon. A horizon that used to mean promise, now only habit. He thought about his son in the city. It had been years since they'd spoken. The last letter had come back unopened. There was a time when Thomas believed he could fix that distance, the way a man mends a fence. But some things can't be patched. Some things just rust quietly. He turned back to the mare. She had lifted her head, nostrils flaring as if smelling something beyond the barn walls. Rain, wind, maybe freedom. Her ears tilted toward him, then toward the hills again. He stepped closer. "Don't even think about it," he said softly. "You ain't walking nowhere on that leg." Still, there was that look again. Something wild, something old. She wanted out. Thomas sighed and leaned against the post. "All right, Whisper," he said finally, trying the name out loud for the first time. "That's what I'll call you, because you don't talk much neither." The name fit. Whisper. The sound of it hung in the air, light as dust. As night fell, the barn filled with the orange glow of a kerosene lamp. Thomas lay on the hay beside her, too tired to move. The mare breathed slow and steady now, her sides warm under the blanket. He watched her chest rise and fall, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Fragile, but real. Outside, the crickets returned, chirping against the hum of the earth. Inside, man and horse shared the same rhythm, the same quiet will to keep going. Before his eyes closed, Thomas murmured, "You rest easy, girl. Tomorrow's a new day." The lamp flickered, shadows dancing across the cracked wall. The painted horses behind them seemed to move again, faintly alive under the trembling light. When dawn came, Whisper was still breathing. Weak, but alive. She lifted her head, eyes bright with a glint that hadn't been there before. Thomas smiled, feeling the ache in his back as he stood. "Guess you ain't ready to die," he said. "Neither am I." And with those words, he stepped into the morning, the frost crisp beneath his boots, a man who no longer walked alone. The third morning broke colder than the last, the kind of cold that crept beneath skin and stayed there. Thomas Rayner stepped outside the barn with the bucket in his hand, the ground crunching under a thin crust of frost. The sun was a dull smear behind clouds, the air still carrying the metallic scent of rain. His breath came out white. Somewhere behind him, Whisper shifted, her hooves scraping softly on the wood floor. He walked to the trough, tilted the bucket, and waited for the slow trickle of water from the rain barrel. Nothing came. He struck the side with his palm, only a hollow echo. The barrel was dry. His stomach sank a little. He hadn't realized how much they'd used the night before. "Damn," he muttered. He set the bucket down and looked toward the field. A thin ribbon of earth cut through the pasture, a creek that once brought meltwater down from the hills. That little stream had fed his crops and his life. Now it lay empty, a scar of cracked clay. Thomas followed it down to the bend, boots sliding on frozen dirt. The creek bed stretched pale and lifeless, lined with the bones of fish long gone. He crouched, touching the cracked surface. It crumbled like ash between his fingers. Somewhere deep in the valley, the earth was drying from the inside out. Behind him, Whisper neighed softly, as if calling him back. He turned, saw her standing at the fence, head high, mane moving in the cold wind. Her leg was healing faster than it should have, though she still limped slightly. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same will that had kept her alive that first night. She didn't look at him this time. She looked north, toward the mountains. "What you see up there, girl?" he called. She snorted, pawed the ground, then turned her gaze back to the ridge, ears flicking forward. Thomas followed her stare. The mountains sat heavy against the sky, dark and sharp, their tops powdered white with snow. Somewhere up there, the creek began. Maybe the ice had blocked it, or maybe it had shifted course. Either way, no water meant no life. He rubbed his neck, thinking. Whisper flicked her tail, restless. It was like she already knew what he was about to decide. "You're crazy if you think we're going up there," he said, half smiling. "Old fool like me'll freeze before sundown." But the silence answered him back, steady and patient. By midday, he'd packed 2 canteens, a coil of rope, a blanket, and a few slices of jerky. The hills weren't kind to men in winter, but he couldn't just sit and wait for thirst to come knocking. Whisper stood by the gate, shifting her weight from one leg to the other, the air puffing from her nostrils in pale bursts. "All right," he sighed, tightening the saddle strap. "Looks like you win again." The sound of the latch lifting was sharp, like the start of something irreversible. Whisper stepped out into the open, hooves sinking slightly in the thawing mud. The wind cut across the field, carrying the faint scent of pine. They walked side by side toward the hills. Each step seemed to erase the world behind them, the barn, the fence, the ghosts of what had been. The climb began gradual, the earth rising beneath their boots and hooves, then steeper as they entered the shadow of the trees. The forest was silent, except for the creak of branches and the crunch of frost underfoot. Thomas could hear Whisper's breathing beside him, slow and heavy. Once or twice she stumbled, favoring the wounded leg, but each time she found her balance again. Hours passed. The path narrowed, twisting through boulders slick with moss. The light grew dim, swallowed by the canopy above. Thomas's breath burned in his throat. His shoulders ached from the climb. He paused by a fallen tree, lowering the canteen to his lips. Only half a swallow left. He poured the rest into his palm and offered it to Whisper. She drank it without hesitation, eyes closing as the water touched her tongue. "Don't say I never shared," he said with a tired grin. They pressed on. The trees thinned, giving way to a slope scattered with loose rock. Ahead, the sound of wind changed pitch, low, hollow, almost like the distant rush of water. Thomas stopped, listening. Whisper lifted her head, ears twitching toward the sound. It came again. A faint murmur, too rhythmic to be mere wind. He blinked. "You hear that?" Whisper nickered softly, taking a step forward. They followed the sound through the narrow cut of the ridge. The air smelled different now, cleaner, cooler, with a trace of moisture. Hope stirred in Thomas's chest. Maybe the river hadn't died after all. But when they reached the source, the noise fell away to silence. The water was only wind passing through a hollow in the rocks, making an illusion of life. The ground here was dry as bone. Thomas dropped to his knees, pressing his hand to the soil. Dust rose between his fingers. He laughed once, bitterly. "You got me good," he said to no one. Whisper stood still beside him, head lowered, her breath warm against his shoulder. He felt her weight lean ever so slightly toward him, as if she, too, understood disappointment. For a long moment, they stayed that way. Two survivors in a land that had forgotten rain. Then Whisper moved. Her head jerked up, nostrils flaring. She turned east, muscles tightening. Thomas frowned. "What is it now?" The mare didn't move, only stared, her body tense. Somewhere far off, the wind shifted. Thomas thought he heard something faint. A whispering murmur, not wind this time, but water? It came and went like a secret carried on the breeze. He stood slowly. "You think there's more out there?" Whisper looked at him, then started forward without waiting for an answer. "Hey," he called, but she kept walking. Her limp was barely noticeable now. She moved with purpose, the kind of certainty a man can't argue with. Thomas should have turned back. The sun was already sinking, light bleeding gold into the horizon, but he found himself following, drawn by something he couldn't name. The sound was still there, faint, hidden, like hope pretending not to be seen. "Fine," he said, adjusting the pack on his shoulder. "Lead the way, Whisper." As they climbed higher, the air thinned, and the smell of damp earth grew stronger. For the first time in years, Thomas felt something stir inside him. Not fear, not grief, but the fragile ache of belief. He looked up at the fading sky, streaked with pink and gray. The last light caught Whisper's coat, turning it to a burnished copper glow. It was almost beautiful. And as the first stars appeared, Thomas realized he was no longer walking to find water. He was walking because she believed it was there. Somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the ridges, the mountains were waiting. And in the hush between wind and silence, he thought he heard it again. Faint, but real this time. The voice of running water. By the time the first blush of dawn touched the peaks, the valley behind them had vanished in mist. The air was thinner here, laced with pine resin and the faint scent of snow. Thomas Rayner moved slowly along the mountain path, his breath white and ragged, one hand resting on Whisper's neck for balance. The mare's limp had eased, but she still favored the wounded leg when the ground turned steep. Every few steps, she stopped, lifted her head, and listened, as if the mountain itself was whispering to her. The trail narrowed to a ledge barely wider than a wagon plank. Below, fog churned like a living thing, hiding the drop that fell hundreds of feet into the gorge. The sound of loose gravel sliding under their boots echoed long after it fell. Thomas muttered, "If you slip, girl, we're both gone." Whisper's ears flicked, unbothered. She stepped forward anyway. As they climbed higher, the pines gave way to rock and wind. It wasn't the dry heat of the plains now, but a clean, cold wind that bit his skin and smelled of untouched places. The world grew quieter, the kind of silence that presses against the bones. Somewhere far below, a hawk circled and cried once, a sound so distant it felt like memory. They rested at noon beside a wall of stone darkened by time. Thomas unwrapped a piece of jerky and split it, chewing one half, offering the other to Whisper. She ignored it and kept staring toward the ridge, her nostrils flaring. "Suit yourself," he said. "You're the one who wanted this." He drank a sip from his canteen, swirled what little remained, and grimaced. When he looked up again, the light had shifted. Clouds were gathering, dark and slow, like smoke rolling over the peaks. The temperature dropped in minutes. Thomas tightened the straps on his coat, feeling the wind claw at him. "We'd better find cover," he said, scanning the ridge. The sky answered with a distant rumble. They followed the slope upward until the first flakes began to fall, drifting sideways in the wind. Whisper shook her mane, snow catching in the dark strands. The storm came faster than he expected, swallowing the path. Visibility shrank to yards. He could see only the outline of the mare's shoulders in front of him. "Keep going, girl," he called over the wind. "Find us a place, anywhere." The mountain roared around them, wind, snow, and the cracking sound of ice peeling from cliffs. Thomas bent low against it, eyes stinging, boots slipping on rock slick with frost. Whisper pushed forward, her body angled against the gale. Then suddenly, she stopped. He almost walked into her. "What is it?" he shouted. The wind tore the words away. Whisper tossed her head toward the cliff wall, ears pinned forward. Through the swirl of snow, he saw a dark opening, a shallow hollow in the rock face. Salvation. He led her inside, the change immediate. The howling dropped to a muffled hum, replaced by the steady drip of meltwater from the ceiling. The space was small, just enough for man and horse. Thomas slumped against the stone, chest heaving. Whisper stood still beside him, her body trembling from exertion. "Guess you saved us again," he said softly, voice roughened by cold. The fire took forever to start. His matches were damp, his hands numb, but finally the spark caught, the flame trembling to life against the wind's breath. Orange light danced along the walls, revealing ancient scars carved by centuries of rain. He stretched his hands toward the warmth, watching the shadows of his fingers shake. Whisper shifted, lowering her head toward the flame. The heat softened the lines of her face, steam rising from her coat. Her eyes reflected the fire. Two small mirrors holding light in the dark. Thomas found himself speaking just to fill the quiet. "You ever wonder why some of us keep going when there ain't a damn thing left to find?" The horse blinked once, slow, unanswering. He took a slow breath, the air thick with smoke and damp earth. "My wife used to paint mountains," he said after a while. "Said every ridge had its own soul. I never understood that. I just saw rocks and snow." He smiled faintly. Maybe that's why she loved them more than me. The storm raged outside for hours, the wind a low, endless growl. Thomas drifted in and out of half-sleep, the sound blending with dreams. Flashes of Mabel's laughter, the smell of turpentine, the way sunlight once filtered through her hair. When he woke, the fire was nearly gone. Whisper stood watch near the entrance, snow blowing in behind her like silver dust. Beyond the veil of white, he thought he saw something shimmer. Not light exactly, but motion. A faint glint that pulsed, then vanished. He rubbed his eyes. Nothing but snow. Still, the air had changed. The wind carried moisture now, cool and damp, the scent of water. He rose, stiff and sore, and walked to the cave mouth. The snow was easing. Through the thinning curtain he could see the slope ahead, steep but walkable. He placed a hand on Whisper's neck. "Think we're close, don't you?" She turned her head, ears twitching toward the unseen valley below. A single drop of melted snow slid down her mane and fell to the ground with a soft hiss. Thomas smiled at the sound. It reminded him of rain, the kind that promised something green. When morning came, the storm was gone, leaving the mountain quiet and glittering. The world looked washed clean, every rock glazed with ice, every branch heavy with snow. Whisper stepped out first, her breath forming clouds in the new sunlight. Thomas followed, the crunch of snow underfoot loud in the stillness. Behind them, the cave mouth glowed faintly with the dying embers of the fire. Ahead, the trail curved around a ridge and disappeared into mist. Whisper paused, sniffing the air. Somewhere beyond that bend, the faint murmur of water called again, distant but real this time. Thomas exhaled, a mix of relief and disbelief. "All right, girl," he said. "You lead, I'll follow." The wind answered softly, pushing at their backs as they started forward. Two figures against the endless white, walking not toward survival, but toward something neither could name yet. The morning after the storm was silent, in a way that felt unnatural, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. The snow, melted by the weak sun, ran in silver threads down the rocks, whispering faintly as it disappeared into the soil. Thomas Rayner blinked into the pale light, his bones stiff, his breath slow. Whisper stood beside him, her coat steaming in the chill air, eyes fixed on the mist-shrouded ridge ahead. They followed the slope downward, stepping through patches of wet moss and black stone. The trail wound between cliffs, narrow and treacherous, but the sound Thomas had dreamed of through the night, the soft trickle of running water, was real now, somewhere beyond the bend. His chest ached from the climb, but he pressed on. "You were right again," he murmured, half smiling. "Always are." Whisper flicked her ears but didn't look back. She moved with surprising strength, her limp barely visible. Every few paces, she paused to sniff the air, the way wild horses do when they sense weather changing. Thomas followed her lead. It seemed foolish not to. The sound of water grew clearer until it filled the air, echoing faintly off stone. When they reached the edge of the ravine, Thomas saw the source. A small stream trickling through the rocks, narrow as a rope, but alive. The sight made him laugh out loud, a rusty sound he hardly recognized as his own. "There you are," he said. "The world ain't done with us yet." He knelt, cupping his hands to drink. The water was icy, pure as glass. Whisper stepped in beside him, lowering her muzzle. They drank together, the rhythm of survival shared without words. When he lifted his head again, Thomas caught something strange, a shimmer in the corner of his eye. The reflection of water on the rock wall looked almost like movement, the shape of a person standing just beyond the rippling light. He turned sharply, heart hammering. But there was nothing there. Only wet stone and silence. He rubbed his face. "Too long without sleep," he muttered, though the air around him still felt different. Heavy, like before a summer storm. They followed the stream as it snaked along the gorge. The path widened into a hollow of stone and ash trees. The sky above was a broken gray, light filtering through in soft columns. Whisper stopped suddenly, her ears pinned back. She let out a low sound, a cross between a snort and a sigh, and stamped her hoof once. Thomas frowned. "What is it?" The mare stared at something he couldn't see, nostrils flaring. A breeze passed through the hollow, carrying the faint smell of rain on dry dust. Impossible in this cold air. Thomas shivered. It wasn't fear exactly, but recognition. The scent pulled him somewhere else. A memory of Mabel painting by the window, the storm rolling over the fields, her laughter bright against the thunder. He closed his eyes, and for a heartbeat he could almost hear her voice. "Tom, don't hide from the rain. It's the only thing that remembers how to begin again." When he opened his eyes, Whisper was looking at him, as if she too had heard. They moved on until the land flattened into a clearing framed by aspen trees, their bark pale as bone. The stream spread here into a pool, shallow but wide. The surface was still, except for the falling drops from the cliffs above. Thomas knelt again, scooping water into his hat to wash Whisper's wounded leg. She flinched, then relaxed, the tension easing from her muscles. "There now," he said quietly. "Better, ain't it?" He leaned back, studying the pool. The reflection of the sky wavered in it. Gray clouds, streaks of white. Then slowly another shape formed. A woman's outline, faint but undeniable, her hair drifting like smoke across her shoulders. Mabel. Thomas froze. The image trembled with the ripples of the water, her face never fully clear, but the feeling was enough to twist something deep inside him. He reached out a hand, trembling. "Mabel." The reflection flickered, vanished with the next gust of wind. Only the water remained. Whisper snorted sharply, breaking the spell. She stepped between him and the pool, her dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that almost felt human. He let out a shaky breath. "All right," he whispered. "I'm losing my damn mind. But maybe that's what it takes to start believing again." He rose to his feet. The wind had changed direction, carrying the faintest sound. A waterfall, distant but steady. He looked toward the mountainside where the stream disappeared into the trees. "You hear that, girl?" he said. "Could be the end of this road." Whisper turned her head toward the sound, ears pricked. The faint light reflected in her eyes like tiny fires. As they started walking again, the air grew warmer, wetter. Clouds rolled low, dragging their shadows across the forest floor. Somewhere above, thunder murmured, a ghostly echo in the distance. Thomas tilted his face upward, letting the first soft drops fall against his skin. After so many dry seasons, the sensation was almost holy. He closed his eyes, smiling. Whisper's mane caught the rain, tiny beads glistening on each strand. For the first time in years, Thomas didn't feel alone. He felt watched, not by fear, but by something vast and gentle, something that wanted him to keep going. By the time dusk came, they had reached a high ridge overlooking the valley. Below, through breaks in the fog, he caught glimpses of what looked like silver light threading through the trees, a waterfall, hidden and alive, calling them onward. Whisper stamped her hoof, softly, and gave a short, low whinny, as if confirming what he saw. Thomas laid a hand on her neck. "Tomorrow," he said, voice quiet, reverent. "We'll find it tomorrow." That night, they camped under the shelter of 2 leaning pines. The rain fell light but steady, hissing softly on the coals of a small fire. Thomas lay back on the damp ground, staring into the dark canopy above. He could still hear the whisper of the waterfall somewhere beyond the ridge, mingling with the patter of rain. "Ghosts of rain," he murmured. "You never really left, did you?" Whisper's breathing steadied beside him, slow and even. He reached out and rested his hand on her flank, feeling the warmth of life beneath the damp coat. The night wrapped around them like a memory, half dream, half promise. Somewhere beyond the trees, the water kept calling. The next morning rose in a mist the color of pewter, the kind that hides both distance and direction. Thomas Rayner woke stiff and sore, his blanket heavy with dew. The fire had died sometime in the night, leaving only the faint smell of smoke. Whisper stood a few paces away, nose to the ground, sniffing the damp leaves. Her breath fogged in the cold air, forming small clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. Thomas pushed himself upright and rubbed his hands together. His joints ached like old wood in winter. "You're too old for this, Rayner," he muttered. But the moment he looked toward the ridge where the faint sound of water had echoed the night before, something inside him stirred. It wasn't hope, exactly. Hope was too bright, too fragile a word. It was more like obligation, the kind that pulls a man forward when he doesn't yet know why. He packed what little they had left, the half-empty jerky pouch, a single canteen, and Mabel's old scarf he'd tied around his wrist to keep it near. Whisper watched him, ears flicking, then stepped closer, lowering her head as if waiting for his cue. Her leg had healed almost miraculously, still scarred, but strong. "All right, girl," he said, tightening the strap on her bridle. "Let's finish what you started." The climb began before sunrise. The trail wound through a tangle of fir trees and granite outcrops slick with moss. Each step sank into mud that smelled of pine and rot. As they moved, the forest seemed to close behind them, swallowing their path. Thomas tried not to think about that. His breath grew shallow, his heartbeat matching the rhythm of Whisper's hooves. The higher they climbed, the quieter it grew. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Wind sighed through the trees, carrying the sharp tang of minerals and distant snow. The sound of water returned, faint, but steady, sometimes near, sometimes fading, as though teasing them forward. By noon, clouds had gathered again, pressing low and gray against the peaks. Thomas stopped at a narrow ledge to catch his breath. The valley stretched below, a blur of mist and shadow. He could see his life laid out there. The broken barn, the empty field, all the years that had dried him from the inside out. "Don't look back," he whispered to himself. "Ain't nothing left down there anyway." Whisper nudged his shoulder, soft and insistent. He smiled weakly. Yeah, I know. Keep walking. The path narrowed to little more than a seam in the rock. Water trickled along it now, forming small rivulets that sparkled under the dull sky. Whisper's hooves splashed, softly. Thomas reached out to steady himself against the cliff face, cold and wet under his palm. Each drop that hit his skin felt like a heartbeat, steady and alive. At one bend, the trail opened briefly into a flat of shale scattered with bits of quartz. The light struck the stones just right, and for a moment the whole ground seemed to shimmer. Thomas stopped, mesmerized. Whisper snorted behind him, impatient. Yeah, he said, smiling faintly. Guess it's just rocks to you. They pressed on. As afternoon deepened, the air grew thinner and colder. Thomas's vision blurred around the edges. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. He forced one foot in front of the other, muttering to keep himself awake. Whisper never slowed. Even limping, she moved with a kind of stubborn grace that made him ashamed of his weakness. Then, without warning, the wind shifted again. It carried the unmistakable roar of falling water. Not a trickle this time, but power. It was faint, but real, echoing through the ravine. Thomas froze, listening. Whisper's head shot up, ears pricked. There, he breathed. You hear it too. He felt it before he saw it. A pulse in the air, rhythmic, alive. The path curved sharply between two walls of stone, and suddenly the noise grew thunderous. The mountain itself seemed to hum. Thomas's pulse quickened. We found it, he whispered. But the final stretch was the hardest. The trail rose almost straight upward, a jagged climb of rock and mud slick with water. He tied the rope around Whisper's bridle to guide her slowly. His hands bled from gripping stone. Twice he slipped, knees striking sharp edges, but each time he pushed up again. Whisper climbed behind him, steady and unyielding, her breath harsh but strong. When they reached the top, Thomas's legs gave out. He fell to his knees, gasping, his chest on fire. Then he heard it clearly. No echo, no illusion. The waterfall. It wasn't loud in the way storms are loud. It was pure, full, constant, like the world exhaling after holding its breath too long. He looked up. Through the veil of mist ahead, something glimmered. A silver thread cutting through black rock, half hidden by trees. He couldn't see the full fall yet, but the sight was enough to make his throat tighten. You did it, he said, voice breaking. Whisper stepped beside him, eyes fixed on the light, her mane tangled and wet. She let out a low, deep sound, a rumble that wasn't fear or exhaustion, but recognition. Thomas stared at her, the corners of his mouth trembling into a smile. You knew, didn't you? Damn it, you knew the whole time. The mare blinked once, slow and steady, then turned her gaze back to the silver glow through the trees. For a moment, the light reflected in her dark eyes, and Thomas saw something in them he couldn't name. Something ancient. Something that had waited for him longer than time itself. He rose slowly, muscles trembling. Come on, he said, voice hoarse. Let's see what's been calling you. They moved toward the sound, the ground softening under their steps, the air growing cooler, wetter, alive with the scent of moss and stone. Each breath Thomas took filled him with something sharp and sweet, like the memory of youth. By the time the trees opened to the valley ahead, the light had turned golden. Mist swirled in ribbons, catching the sun. Whisper stepped forward, ears flicking, body tense with anticipation. Thomas followed, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't yet see the waterfall, but he could feel it, close enough to touch. And as they stood at the threshold between the mountain's shadow and whatever waited beyond, the world seemed to hold still again. He reached out, brushing his hand against Whisper's neck. "If we die up here," he murmured, "at least we'll die finding something that matters." Whisper snorted softly, shaking her mane as if to disagree. Her eyes were bright, full of a faith he didn't yet understand. Together, they took the final steps toward the light. The light came first, a shimmer through the trees, shifting and alive. It wasn't the flat light of morning or the pale glare of snow, but something richer, molten, like liquid silver poured over stone. Thomas Raynor stopped where the trail bent and felt the sound before he fully heard it. A low, steady thunder rolled through the earth beneath his boots, and the air thickened with mist. Whisper lifted her head, nostrils flaring, her mane brushing against his arm. The wind carried a scent he hadn't known in years: wet stone, moss, and life. They stepped through the final curtain of trees. What opened before them didn't seem possible. A sheer cliff split the mountain's heart, and from its crown spilled a waterfall so high it vanished into the clouds above. It fell in endless sheets of white fire, crashing into a pool that glowed green and clear at its base. Spray filled the air, drifting in soft halos that caught the sunlight like fragments of glass. The sound of it swallowed the world, a rhythm older than language. Thomas just stood there, hat in his hand, breath shaking in his chest. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. Whisper took a step forward, hooves sinking into the wet grass. The light broke across her coat, turning her brown hide to copper flame. She let out a low sound, not quite a whinny, not quite a sigh, as though she recognized the place. Thomas walked to the edge of the pool. The ground was slick, the soil dark and rich. He knelt, dipped his hands into the water, and drank. It was cold enough to sting, clean enough to make him tremble. When he lifted his head, the world looked sharper, the greens deeper, the sky brighter. He laughed, a full sound that startled even him. "We made it, girl. You did it." Whisper came to his side and plunged her muzzle into the water. She drank like she'd never known thirst before, tail flicking, the wound on her leg washed clean in the shallows. Thomas reached to touch her shoulder. "You saved us both," he said. His voice cracked on the words. For a long while, he simply sat there, watching the way the water caught light and turned it into movement. The roar of the falls became a kind of music, steady and endless. Above them, clouds drifted apart, revealing a slice of blue sky. The air was cool, but not cruel anymore. It was the kind of air that made a man believe in second chances. He set up a small fire near the rocks, feeding it with driftwood and dry bark from his pack. Smoke curled upward, lost almost immediately in the mist. Whisper grazed nearby, tail swishing lazily. Thomas warmed his hands and let the peace of the place seep into him. He thought about how close he'd come to dying, about the dry creek, the storm, the long climb, and how every step of the way had led him here. He didn't understand it. Maybe he didn't need to. "You led me," he said softly. "All this time, you knew." Whisper looked up, ears twitching at his voice. He smiled. "I don't deserve to see this, but thank you anyway." When the sun dipped lower, turning the mist gold, Thomas noticed something odd. Behind the waterfall, where the water struck the cliff, there was darkness. Not just shadow, but an opening. A small cave mouth, half hidden by the sheet of falling water. He squinted, stepping closer. The mist cooled his skin. The entrance was narrow, just enough for a man to slip through if he dared. The roar of the falls grew deafening as he approached. The spray soaked his shirt, plastered his hair to his forehead. Whisper whinnied behind him, uneasy. "It's all right," he called over the thunder. "Just taking a look." But even as he said it, his pulse quickened. He leaned forward, eyes straining through the cascade. For a moment he thought he saw something move in the darkness beyond. A flicker of light, like fire on wet stone. Then it was gone. He blinked, wiped the water from his face, and took a step back. "Not tonight," he murmured. "Tomorrow." Whisper snorted, stamping her hoof, as if in agreement. Thomas chuckled. "You're smarter than I am, I swear." He turned from the falls and looked across the valley. The last of the sun hung low, casting long shadows over the grass. The waterfall shimmered in that dying light, turning silver to amber, then to a deep, glowing red. It looked alive, breathing, pulsing with its own heart. As darkness settled, Thomas built a small camp at the base of the cliffs. The fire crackled softly, its warmth mixing with the cool spray of the falls. Whisper lay nearby, her head resting on her foreleg, eyes half closed. Thomas leaned against a rock, his body finally at rest, but his mind alive. He thought of Mabel. He could almost hear her voice in the sound of the water. She would have painted this place, every stroke slow and deliberate, the way she painted everything she loved. "You'd have called it something poetic," he whispered to the night. "Not the waterfall, something like Silver Veil." The name hung in the air, perfect and inevitable. He smiled, though it hurt. "Guess that's what you are, huh? A veil between what's gone and what's left." The fire hissed softly as mist fell onto it. Above, the stars began to show, faint through the drifting clouds. Thomas lay back, his hat over his eyes, listening to the waterfall's steady voice. The sound filled the spaces inside him that silence had once owned. As sleep crept closer, he reached out toward Whisper, his hand brushing the rough texture of her mane. "We made it, girl," he murmured. "Let's rest a bit before we see what's hiding behind that silver curtain." The waterfall thundered on, eternal and unknowable, while the man and the horse lay side by side under its mist. The mountain hummed softly around them, as if it, too, had been waiting for someone to arrive. When Thomas's eyes closed at last, he dreamed not of deserts or storms, but of water, falling, endless, bright as mercy. When morning came, the mist rose thick from the valley, like smoke from a sleeping fire. Thomas Rayner awoke to the sound of the waterfall's endless breathing, a steady, unbroken thunder that filled every corner of the air. He stretched, joints creaking, and turned toward the light spilling through the mist. Whisper stood near the water's edge, ears twitching, her body shimmering with dew. She looked rested, almost reborn. Thomas rubbed the sleep from his eyes and took in the sight again. The silver cascade, the way sunlight fractured through it, bending into soft ribbons of color. "You ever seen anything like it?" he said, his voice hoarse, but calm. Whisper didn't answer, of course. She only turned her head toward the sound of the falls, her dark eyes reflecting the shimmer. He walked to the pool and knelt. The surface was glass clear, and in it he saw both their reflections, one old, one strong, both marked by the same dust of the world. For a while, he simply stared, letting the noise and light wash through him. Then his gaze drifted again to the dark shape behind the veil of water. The cave. The secret that had been waiting through centuries of silence. It called to him, not loudly, but persistently, like a half-remembered melody. He stood, wiping his hands on his coat. "Guess we ought to see what's hiding behind all that noise," he murmured. Whisper stamped her hoof, snorting softly, as if warning him. "Don't look at me that way," he said with a crooked grin. "I ain't stupid enough to go rushing in." Still, he found himself walking closer. The spray chilled his skin, clinging to his beard and lashes. Every step made the roar louder until it filled his chest. He reached the edge, peering through the curtain of falling water. The darkness beyond it pulsed faintly, as though alive. Thomas hesitated. He looked back at Whisper, who had lifted her head, eyes locked on him. The horse took one slow step forward, then stopped, muscles tense. He could feel her unease even through the distance. "All right," he said. "I'll just take a peek." He drew a breath, braced himself, and stepped through the veil. The shock of cold hit him like a slap. The water hammered his shoulders, drenched his clothes, stole the air from his lungs. He gasped, stumbling forward into the darkness beyond. The roar softened immediately, muffled by the stone walls. The air changed, cooler, heavier, laced with the scent of earth and iron. His boots scraped against the slick rock. For a moment he stood still, breathing hard. Then slowly, his eyes began to adjust. Faint light leaked through the water behind him, shimmering over the damp walls. Drops fell from the ceiling in slow rhythm, echoing into the cavern's hollow chest. Thomas reached into his coat, pulled out a match, and struck it. The flame flared weakly, casting a small halo of gold. What it revealed made him freeze. The rock wasn't raw and wild. It was shaped, smoothed by hands. Lines had been carved into the stone, spirals, arrows, strange symbols that twisted and met like rivers. He stepped closer, running his fingers along the grooves. The markings were old, older than anything he'd ever seen, but some felt almost familiar, as though drawn by someone who had once known the same sky. He moved deeper into the cave. The floor sloped downward, where the sound of dripping water grew louder. His match flickered, revealing something glinting in the corner. A shard of metal, maybe iron. He crouched and brushed away the dirt. It wasn't just metal. It was the broken edge of a paint can, rusted thin. Nearby, streaks of faded color stained the wall. Red, ochre, white. His heart lurched. He lifted the flame higher. There, on the wall, under centuries of soot and moss, was a fragment of paint. Human paint, not natural pigment. A brushstroke, curved and deliberate. Another above it. The lines formed a vague shape. A horse's head, graceful and half-finished. Beneath it, faint but readable, were words carved into the rock. "He leads, you follow." Thomas staggered back, his hand trembling. "No," he whispered. "That ain't possible." The flame guttered, throwing shadows that danced across the horse's painted face. It was her handwriting. Mabel's. The same looping hand she used to sign the back of her canvases. The same soft pressure that once trailed across his arm when she painted by lamplight. He reached out, touching the grooves. The stone was cold, but he felt warmth all the same. An echo of her, somehow still here. For a long time, he didn't move. The flame burned lower, his breath uneven. Then the match hissed out, plunging him into total dark. He struck another, hands shaking. The light revealed more, a few brushes scattered near the wall, their handles brittle but unmistakably hers. He remembered that day years ago, when she had ridden off with her sketchbook and said she wanted to paint the sound of water. He'd told her she was crazy, that mountains were no place for dreams. When she never came back, he'd blamed the storm, the trail, himself. But never once had he imagined she'd made it here. The truth hit him like a wave. She'd found this place before him, the waterfall, the cave, the message. She'd been here, seen this same silver light, and left her final mark before the mountain took her. Thomas dropped to his knees. The match burned down to his fingers, and he let it fall. The darkness closed around him again, but this time it felt less empty. He whispered into it, "You found it first, didn't you, Mabel?" His voice cracked, swallowed by the cave's breath. A sound echoed from outside, the faint whinny of whisper, sharp and anxious. He looked toward the waterfall's curtain, now a ghostly light against the black. The horse's silhouette appeared for an instant, head lowered, waiting. Thomas took a deep breath and stood. He wiped his face, though he couldn't tell if it was tears or mist on his cheeks. "I'm coming, girl," he said softly. Before leaving, he pressed his hand against the painted wall one last time. "Thank you," he whispered, to Mabel, to the mountain, to the silence. Then he turned toward the veil of water and stepped back through. The light hit him full in the face. The roar of the falls returned, fierce and alive. Whisper was there, pawing the ground, eyes wide. Thomas walked to her, soaked and shaking, but smiling through the exhaustion. He placed a hand on her mane. "You were right all along," he said, voice rough but steady. "She led me here." Whisper exhaled, warm air puffing against his sleeve. Thomas looked back at the waterfall, its silver curtain glinting in the sun, hiding the cave's secret once more. "We'll keep it safe," he said quietly. "No one else needs to know." The wind carried the mist across them, cool and clean. Whisper lowered her head beside him, and together they watched the water fall, two souls standing guard over the past, and whatever piece of it had finally found peace. The air outside the cave was warmer than Thomas Rayner remembered. Or maybe it was just that his blood had started moving again. The roar of the waterfall thundered behind him, constant, eternal. He sat in the grass, drenched to the bone, his hands still trembling from what he had seen. Whisper grazed quietly nearby, her ears flicking whenever the wind changed. Every so often, she'd lift her head and glance toward the veil of water, as if she too felt the presence hidden there. Thomas took a slow breath, staring down at his hands. Bits of red paint still clung to his skin, smeared from the cave wall. He rubbed his thumb over it, watching the color fade into his palm. "She was here," he whispered. The words caught in his throat like splinters. "All these years. And I never believed she made it." He remembered the morning she left, the smell of turpentine on her coat, the sound of her boots on the porch. "Just a few sketches, Tom," she'd said, smiling the way only she could, like light breaking through cloud. "You'll see." But she hadn't come back. And he had never gone looking this far. He told himself the mountain had taken her, and the story ended there. But it hadn't. Not really. He turned toward the falls. The mist caught the sun, bending it into faint arcs of color. Beneath that beauty was the darkness of the cave, holding her last message. He leads, you follow. Thomas let the phrase roll through him again. At first he thought she'd meant the horse. Now he wasn't so sure. Maybe it was something larger, about faith or love, or the quiet things that pull us through our years without asking for applause. Whisper stepped closer and nudged his shoulder gently, her breath warm against his cheek. He smiled faintly. "Yeah, I know so no. She left more than paint, didn't she?" He reached out and stroked the mare's neck. "Guess she left you too." He didn't mean it literally, but something in the thought made him pause. Whisper had wandered into his life out of nowhere, wounded, half dead, as if guided by invisible hands. And somehow, she'd led him here, to Mabel's hidden place. It didn't make sense, but grief rarely did. Thomas stood, joints aching, and walked back toward the waterfall. He stared at the churning silver sheet, the way it hid the entrance completely now. If he hadn't stepped inside himself, he'd have never known it was there. "You wanted it to stay secret," he murmured. "That's why you never came home. You couldn't explain it." He bent down and picked up a flat stone, its edges smoothed by water. For a moment, he turned it in his hands. Then he pulled Mabel's scarf from his wrist, the one he'd carried for years, faded to the color of rose ash, and wrapped it carefully around the stone. He laid it at the base of the waterfall, just where the spray turned to mist. "For you," he said quietly. "For what you found." Whisper came to stand beside him. Together they watched as the wind shifted, sending a fine spray over them both. The sound of the water filled every silence he'd carried inside. He sat again near the fire he'd rebuilt, feeding it with twigs and fallen branches. The flames reflected in the water, bending and trembling like a memory too, fragile to touch. The smell of smoke mingled with moss and wet earth, grounding him to the moment. "You know," he said aloud, voice rough, "I spent years thinking you left because you were tired of me, because I didn't dream big enough. Turns out you just went where the world told you to go." He laughed under his breath, a sound between sorrow and relief. "And now here I am, following the same damn road." He stared into the flames until his eyes burned. In the dance of light, he saw her face again, smiling, eyes soft, hair lifted by wind. Not the ghost of pain this time, but a memory made gentle by distance. When night began to fall, the mist thickened again. The air glowed faintly under the moon. Whisper shifted her weight, settling down near him. Thomas lay back on the grass, staring at the silver streak of the waterfall cutting through the dark. "We'll stay a while," he murmured. "Ain't nowhere else I'd rather be." He closed his eyes and listened. The waterfall sounded different now, almost like breathing. Steady, calm, alive. Each rise and fall matched his own pulse. Somewhere inside that rhythm, he thought he heard her voice again, soft as it had been the day she left. "Keep walking, Tom. There's more to see." He opened his eyes, tears slipping down his temple. "You still bossing me around," he whispered with a smile. Whisper lifted her head at the sound, as if she understood. Thomas pushed himself upright and watched the mare for a moment. Her coat shimmered in the moonlight, wet with dew, her dark eyes deep and still. "You'll carry her memory now," he said softly. "That's what you're here for." He took one last look at the falls before lying down again. The spray reached him even here, cool and fine as breath. Above the thunder, he could hear the faint rustle of the forest, settling into sleep. Whisper's breathing slowed beside him, a soft rhythm in the dark. Tomorrow, they'd build a small shelter nearby. Maybe plant something, wildflowers or pine saplings, to mark the spot. He didn't need a grave. She'd already left her story carved in stone. For now, he closed his eyes and let the world hum around him. The waterfall never stopped. Neither did memory. And somewhere between them, he found peace. Not the kind that ends sorrow, but the kind that lets a man live with it. As he drifted toward sleep, the last thing he heard was the sound of Whisper shifting her weight, a soft snort of contentment. The earth was wet, the fire warm, the air alive. For the first time in years, Thomas felt full, not of answers, but of meaning. The morning came slow, as if the world itself didn't want to wake. Mist hung low across the hollow, drifting in soft ribbons through the grass. The waterfall glowed faintly in the dawn light. Its roar softened to a hum, like the pulse of a living heart beneath stone. Thomas Rayner stirred beside the dying embers of the fire, the ache in his back reminding him he was still human, still old. Whisper stood nearby, her breath rising in steady clouds, ears twitching to the rhythm of the falls. Thomas sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The world looked washed clean after the night. Drops clung to every blade of grass, to every leaf, each one catching light like tiny shards of glass. "You hear that, girl?" he said quietly. "She's still talking." Whisper turned her head, eyes calm and knowing. He rose, every bone protesting, and walked toward the base of the waterfall. The air there was colder, sharper, the kind that makes a man feel both small and alive. He could barely see the cave now behind the veil of water, its entrance a faint shadow in all that silver. "Don't worry," he murmured. "Your secret's safe." He looked down at the scarf-wrapped stone he'd left the night before. It was soaked through now, the color deepened by the water. Something in him wanted to move it, to bury it under earth where time wouldn't wash it away. But no. This was where she belonged. Mabel had chosen this place, and now the mountain had chosen him to keep it. Thomas crouched and whispered a few words he hadn't said in years. Not prayer exactly, but something close. Something shaped like gratitude. When he stood again, he felt lighter. For once, the silence inside him wasn't hollow. It was full of her, of the sound of the water, of the soft rhythm of Whisper's breathing behind him. He turned back toward the meadow. "Come on, girl. Let's build something worth staying for." The day passed in slow, deliberate labor. He gathered branches and stones, shaping a small shelter against the cliff. Whisper grazed nearby, lifting her head every so often to watch him work. She didn't wander far. He spoke to her as he worked, the way a man talks when he doesn't want to hear himself think too loudly. "You ever notice," he said, tying the frame together, "the world's louder when it's empty? Guess that's why we fill it with noise. But not here." By evening, the makeshift shelter stood, crooked but sturdy. He stepped back, wiping his hands. It wasn't much, but it would keep the rain off. The waterfall's mist carried the smell of moss and wet stone. He took it in with a deep breath. "Smells like home, don't it?" Whisper snorted softly, shaking her mane. Her coat gleamed copper in the fading sun. They ate a simple meal that night. What little jerky was left, softened in water. Thomas chewed slow, staring at the silver curtain of water. Every time the light shifted, he thought he saw movement inside. Shadows turning, faint glimmers of color. But he didn't go back in. Some places are meant to be found only once. When darkness settled, he lit a small fire and sat near it, the warmth crawling back into his bones. Whisper lay beside him, her head resting on her foreleg. The sound of the falls wrapped around them both, steady and endless. Thomas took the scarf from his wrist, his last piece of Mabel he hadn't given to the water, and held it over the firelight. The threads caught the glow, turning from gray to gold. "You'd like it here," he said softly. "It's quiet. Too quiet for most folks, but you always loved quiet." He smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why you painted so much. You wanted to make the silence say something." He folded the scarf and placed it inside his coat pocket. "Some things you don't give to the mountain. Some you keep, so the heart remembers." The night deepened. The fire crackled, and the stars appeared, scattered like seeds across the sky. Thomas leaned back, listening to the steady thunder of the falls. "We'll stay a while," he murmured. "Not forever, just long enough to learn how to breathe again." He closed his eyes, letting the sound carry him. Behind the waterfall, unseen, the cave held its own breath, keeping its stories safe. Whisper stirred beside him, shifting closer until her warmth brushed his arm. He smiled in the dark. A shooting star crossed the sky, quick and bright. He didn't make a wish. He'd already found what he hadn't known he was searching for. Peace without answers. In the quiet hours before dawn, he woke again, sensing movement. Whisper stood at the edge of the pool, staring into the water. Her reflection shimmered beside the image of the falls. Thomas rose slowly, heart pounding, not with fear, but with awe. In that moment, framed by moonlight and mist, she looked almost otherworldly, like something Mabel might have painted if she'd ever seen heaven. He stepped closer, whispering, "What do you see, girl?" Whisper turned her head toward him, eyes bright and steady. The silence stretched between them, full of things neither could name. Then she walked to him, pressed her muzzle gently against his chest, and exhaled. Thomas placed a hand over her neck, feeling the pulse there, strong, unbroken. "Yeah," he said softly. "I hear it too." He looked toward the waterfall one last time before the sun began to rise. The mist glowed pale gold, the sound deepening to a slow, rhythmic thunder. He knew then that he wouldn't tell a soul about this place. Not the town, not his son, not even the wind. Some truths live better in silence. Thomas turned back toward the shelter, whispering as he walked. "This stays between us, girl. Between me, you, and her." Whisper followed, her hooves soft on the damp ground. Behind them, the waterfall roared, its endless song swallowing their voices until only the mountain could hear. The next morning, Thomas Rayner woke to the sound of wings. A pair of ravens circled above the cliffs, their shadows sliding across the grass like passing thoughts. The fire had long gone cold. Mist still clung to the valley, but the sky above was clear, a blue so sharp it felt new. Whisper stood near the pool, drinking from the shallow edge, her reflection quivering with every ripple. The waterfall behind them thundered on, unchanged, eternal. Thomas sat up, stiff but rested, and looked around the hollow he'd come to think of as a home. The small shelter he'd built leaned slightly, but it had held through the night. The air smelled of cedar smoke, moss, and wet stone. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what was gone. He was simply here. Still, a part of him knew they couldn't stay forever. The world beyond the mountains would start asking questions. The fields needed tending. The fence would need mending. Even solitude, he thought, needed its boundaries. He rose slowly, brushing dew from his coat. Whisper lifted her head and watched him. "We can't stay, girl," he said gently. "Not forever." She blinked, as if weighing his words, then lowered her head again to drink. Before leaving, Thomas walked to the base of the waterfall. The light struck the water at just the right angle, breaking it into bands of white and blue. He stood there for a moment, the mist kissing his face. "I'll come back," he promised. "You'll always have someone to listen to you." He turned to the small cairn he'd built from smooth stones, marking the place where he'd left Mabel's scarf-wrapped offering. The fabric was still there beneath the spray, darkened by water but whole. He crouched and laid his hand on it. "You rest easy," he whispered. "We'll carry you with us." When he stood again, the wind picked up, tugging gently at his coat. He smiled. "Yeah," he said softly. "I heard you. Time to go." The path down the mountain was different from the climb. The same rocks and ridges, but somehow softer, less cruel. Maybe it was him that had changed. Whisper moved carefully beside him, her hooves steady on the narrow ledges. The wound on her leg had healed into a thin white scar, a mark of survival more than pain. As they descended, Thomas noticed the world opening up again, the forest giving way to long slopes of grass and scattered trees. The air warmed. The hum of insects returned. Every now and then, he'd look back toward the cliffs. The waterfall was hidden now behind distance and mist, but its voice carried faintly on the wind. It sounded like memory, soft, steady, and impossible to forget. They stopped by a stream at midday. Thomas filled the canteen and let Whisper drink her fill. He took a long swallow himself, closing his eyes as the cold water slid down his throat. "Better than any whiskey," he said with a grin. Whisper flicked her ear in mild disapproval. The afternoon light turned golden as they neared the foothills. From there, he could see the valley stretching far below, fields, fences, the faint silver line of the riverbed that had once been dry. He blinked, frowning. It shimmered now, faint but real. Water had returned. He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Looks like you fixed more than me, girl." Whisper nudged his shoulder with her nose, and he stroked her neck. "Don't look at me like that," he said. "You're the one with all the miracles." By dusk, they reached the edge of the forest. The air smelled of sage and dust again, familiar in a way that hurt. Thomas paused at the last ridge before his land. His house was still there in the distance, the barn leaning the same way it always had. Smoke rose from the chimney. Some traveler must have passed by, or maybe the wind just carried someone else's fire. He stood there a long while, the light fading behind them. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think home was a place you could fix with your hands. But maybe it's just wherever you stop running." Whisper turned her head toward him, her eyes catching the last streak of sun. When they finally crossed back into the pasture, the silence was deep. The wind moved through the tall grass like a sigh. The trough by the barn glimmered faintly, filled again by the mountain's mercy. Thomas leaned on the fence, the wood rough under his palms, and let out a long breath. "I'll be damned," he said, smiling. "Didn't think I'd see her full again." Whisper walked to the edge of the water and drank, slow and steady. Thomas watched her, his heart swelling with something that felt both heavy and light. Inside the barn, everything was as he'd left it. The tools, the old crate he used for a chair, the faded painting on the wall that Mabel had started years ago. He struck a match and lit the lantern, filling the space with soft amber light. Dust hung in the air like memory. He looked at the painting. Horses running through a field, unfinished but alive in their motion. For the first time, he didn't feel the ache of absence. He picked up one of Mabel's old brushes, the bristles stiff with time, and smiled. "You never got to finish it," he said. "Maybe I'll give it a try." He turned toward Whisper, who stood framed in the doorway, watching him. "You'll stand for me, won't you?" She flicked her tail, stepping into the light. The way the lantern glow hit her coat made her look almost painted already. Thomas laughed softly, setting the brush down. "Maybe not tonight. We both earned some rest." He sat on the old stool, leaning against the wall. Outside, the moon rose over the ridge, silvering the fields. Whisper settled near the open door, her shadow stretching long across the hay. For a moment, he listened, not for the waterfall or the wind, but for the quiet heartbeat of this place. It was steady, forgiving, alive. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Mabel." Then he added, "And thank you, girl, for leading me home." The night answered with the soft rustle of grass, the low breath of the horse, and the endless, distant echo of falling water. Winter came quietly that year. The Wyoming plains turned the color of pewter, the fields stiff with frost. Thomas Rayner sat on the porch of his weathered farmhouse, wrapped in an old wool coat and serzin, steaming mug between his hands. Whisper grazed a few yards away, her breath rising in soft clouds. Beyond the fence, the horizon shimmered under the pale morning sun, and far in the distance, he could still make out the faint blue line of the mountains, the place that had changed everything. Life had settled back into a rhythm. He fixed the fence posts one by one, patched the roof, and mended the barn door that had been hanging crooked since before Mabel's last summer. But there was no rush in him anymore. The work was slower now, almost reverent, the kind of labor a man does not for survival, but for peace. Some mornings he caught himself talking aloud, as if the mountain could still hear him. "The creek's running again," he said once, his voice half laughter, half disbelief. And it was true. The dry riverbed that had been lifeless for years now shimmered with thin streams of water. It wound through his pasture like a silver thread, whispering softly in the wind. He didn't tell anyone how it happened. When the neighbors rode by and asked about the change, he only shrugged. "Maybe the land finally forgave us," he said. They laughed, thinking it a joke. But Thomas meant every word. Whisper stayed close to him, her limp long gone, her coat grown thick and glossy in the cold. Sometimes she would lift her head suddenly, ears turning toward the north, toward those distant cliffs. Thomas followed her gaze each time. He didn't need to speak. They both knew what she was listening for. One night, near the end of January, the wind came down from the mountains, sharp and dry. It rattled the barn doors and sent a long sigh across the fields. Thomas stepped outside and tilted his face to it, smiling. "You found your way back," he murmured. Whisper came to stand beside him, pressing her shoulder lightly against his. Together they watched the darkness sway with the wind. The next day brought snow, the first real snow of the season. It fell in slow, deliberate flakes, covering the land in silence. Thomas led Whisper out into it, letting her walk freely through the field. Her hooves left a clean trail behind them, twin paths stretching across the white. When they reached the edge of the property, he stopped and turned toward the mountains. The air was still except for the distant murmur of the creek. "I reckon she's watching us," he said softly. Whisper snorted, her breath a puff of white. Thomas chuckled. "Yeah, I know. She's probably painting you right now." They stood there for a long time, the snow thickening around them. The quiet wasn't empty. It was alive, filled with the hum of the earth and the faint echo of falling water far away. Thomas closed his eyes and let the wind brush his face. For the first time, he didn't feel small beneath the sky. He felt part of it. That evening, as dusk fell, he sat by the barn fire, sharpening an old horseshoe nail into a hook. The lantern light flickered on the walls, glinting off Mabel's unfinished painting, the one he'd promised himself he would finish someday. He picked up her old brush and turned it between his fingers. The bristles were worn soft, but still held their shape. He dipped the brush into the paint, hesitated, and then began to work. Slow, patient strokes filled in the space she had left untouched. He didn't try to make it perfect, just true. He painted Whisper standing in a valley of silver mist, her mane lifted by the wind. Behind her, a waterfall glowed faintly under a halo of light. When he stepped back, he realized he was smiling. The painting wasn't Mabel's, not entirely, but it was theirs now, a bridge between the years, a quiet promise fulfilled. Whisper stood in the doorway, watching him. He looked up at her and said softly, "It's done." She blinked once, slow and calm. The firelight caught in her eyes, reflecting a faint shimmer like water in the dark. Thomas cleaned the brush, hung it on the nail beside the door, and blew out the lantern. The room fell into shadow, but the painting glowed faintly in the light of the embers, alive in its stillness. He stepped outside again. The snow had stopped. The sky was clear, stars sharp as pins. The world smelled clean and new. Whisper moved beside him, the warmth of her body cutting the cold. Together they stood at the fence, looking toward the distant mountains. A breeze came down from the ridge, soft and familiar. It carried with it the faintest sound, a whisper of running water, of stone and sky and memory. Thomas closed his eyes and breathed it in. "She's still there," he said quietly. "Still paintin' the world alive." He reached out and ran his hand along Whisper's neck. "We'll go back someday," he promised. "Not to take, not to change, just to listen." The horse turned her head, ears flicking toward him, and for a moment the air between them felt electric, full of unspoken understanding. The wind rose once more, fluttering his coat, carrying the scent of pine and snow. Thomas smiled into the dark. "All right," he said. "Let's go home." They walked back toward the house, the sound of their steps muffled by the snow. Behind them, the wind swept across the field, erasing their footprints one by one, carrying them toward the mountains, toward the waterfall that would keep its secret long after they were gone. Inside the house, the fire glowed steady. The painting on the wall caught a flicker of that light. The horse, the fall, the shimmer of silver mist. And for a brief, impossible moment, it looked as though the water within it moved. The wind outside shifted again, brushing softly against the windows, a voice neither of them could hear anymore, yet both would always know. If this story touched your heart, tell me what you felt in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, because the next story might be the one that stays with you forever.